Hello. Looks like it is time to begin. All right. And before we get into this, I have been told that the bathrooms are functional downstairs, so yes. So we can go and actually not just stand in line back there, so feel free to try them out for a spin. But as far as the lesson goes, we're going to be focusing today on climate change and the biblical worldview. So these next two lessons are bonus lessons. Now, while the Bible doesn't specifically say much about climate change as far as how it's talked about today, the theory of climate change, as far as what you probably have experience with, its foundations do overlap with what the Bible talks about. And as such, it has something to say about its foundations. Now, this and the next lesson we're going to be going over, the foundations of these ideas, the foundations of these theories, don't really align with what the Bible says. Now, this lesson and the next one as well have some political overlap. It is not my intention to be political. I will have to touch upon some political options, some political ideas, but it is not my main focus. My main focus is about the foundation of these ideas and that they do not overlap with what the Bible tells us. And the reason why climate change and the Bible overlap is because a lot of what we know about climate change today is based upon the theory of multiple ice ages. Now, if you remember, way back when we were talking about the ice age and the biblical model, that there was one ice age. It occurred just after the flood due to the conditions of the flood. The flood, the volcanism, all the extra water, heat made the summers very cold because of the volcanism blocking the sunlight, yet all that warm water is making the winters very warm and moist, leading to eventually an ice age after a few hundred years. Now, the secular model does agree that there was at least one ice age. In fact, they say that there is 50 ice ages, so that's where they do not agree. Now, depending on the model, the secular models that you're going to be using, you may get more, may get less, but definitely more than one. Now, each ice age is separated by an interglacial period according to the secular model. An interglacial period is a warm period between glacial periods. So, ice age, warm period, basically. Now, some will say that there's 5 main ages, and depending on how far back you go in their timeline, 2.5, 2 million, 2 billion, it's going to be different as far as the span of their ice age, as far as their interglacials. But they tend to agree that according to the evolutionary secular model, every 100,000 years there is going to be another ice age. Each ice age is going to last for 90,000 years with a 10,000 year interglacial period. That is the period that we are currently living in. So according to their model, when man came over into the Americas, it was at the end of an ice age. The biblical model agrees on that. When man came over into the Americas, it was near the end of the ice age. Now, they say that was 10,000 years ago. The biblical model does not. And so since it was 10,000 years ago, they expect another ice age to occur at any moment. And if you are over 40, 50 years old, you probably remember when that was a big fear. The main reason that they thought there were interglacials, the main reason they thought there was more than one ice age, is because at these glaciers, at these ice sheets, they saw a push of an ice sheet where they saw the till. Remember those geological evidences that show there was an ice age. Then they saw that there was another one on top, and then another one on top. Multiple deposits. Seems like the ice was coming forward multiple times, meaning multiple ice ages. It has since been shown that this is just an ice sheet coming and going. It oscillates. It doesn't have to have multiple ice ages. It's the same ice sheet. It grows sometimes. It shrinks sometimes. It'll grow sometimes and shrink sometimes, not multiple ages. This has been shown that the main evidence, the first evidence to support multiple ice ages, doesn't really support it. So that has moved them on to other evidences, such as ice cores and the oxygen isotopes and other things in these layers. Talking about the oxygen isotopes gets very, very complex. You have to get in physics and you have to spend a lot of time on it. So we won't be going much into depth as far as that. But the main idea is consistent if you just look at the layers. So if you were to go and drill a hole and not destroy what you've gotten out of that hole, but just take a sample of it. So you've got this big long tube that you removed from the ice. You lay them side by side, you get something like this. And you can look up other pictures of this, but basically you got a cylinder of ice with different layers in it. And sometimes you have volcanic ash, sometimes you have other things in these layers, and that's what they're looking at. Now, they assume that each layer is a year, kind of like looking at tree rings. Both of these kinds of chronologies have a lot of assumptions in them. But by counting the layers, they come up to about 110,000 years from the top 90% of the ice sheet. After you get down too far, though, they say you can't count the layers because they've been compressed too much. But some assumptions in this is that ice sheets existed for millions of years and maintained the present height in a state of equilibrium during all that time, meaning that it didn't really grow very much or shrink very much. It stayed about the same amount being put on it every year, equating to these layers that we have. Now, there's a lot of assumptions, especially when you have anything maintaining with no feedback cycles for a very long time. That doesn't usually happen. And two, they think that the annual ice layers at the very bottom basically are going to be so thin as to be unrecognizable. The flood model interpretation says that each of these layers is not a year, but a storm system. And that's what we see today. You see snow system come in, you get snow, you have a few days of sunshine, it melts a little bit, you have another layer come in, snow, and so on. So you get these layers that are storm systems. The same reason why when we look at tree rings, it's not a year necessarily, but simply a cycle of fast growth by a cycle of short growth. Basically, wet or dry. So each layer does not equate to a year. Now, I got ahead of myself with that, sorry. Now, even the secular model, even the secular scientists agree that such storm systems can cause all the same things that they expect to see annually, but also in a shorter period of time. So they admit that this is possible, but they do not hold to it because it does not fit their model, such as moving snow dunes and such. So just as a picture, so you can see the comparison, you have the uniformitarian line here. Basically, each year would produce about this much, and because of compression, it gets thinner and thinner and thinner the deeper you go. The biblical model holds that it's about the same as far as production here, and there isn't a lot of compression. A little bit, you can see the line slants a little bit. But then you have a sudden increase the further deep you go, the further back in time. And so that is during the Ice Age. And you do get some compression here, but otherwise it would be basically about 3 meters of water per year, getting down to about 0.2 meters. Now, one of the main evidence you may see on this is the Greenland Lightning fighters, P-38 Lightning fighters and B-17 Flying Fortress aircraft that were discovered here. So this is a squadron that in World War II was forced to ditch in about 1942 on the southeast side of the Greenland ice sheet, about 18 miles from the ocean. They went back in the 1980s, so about 40 years, and found these planes 260 feet deep in ice and snow. That's quite a bit deep, especially when you're only getting 0.2 meters per year. That's less than a foot. Now they say that because these planes are shiny and metal, basically, they absorbed sunlight and sunk 200 some feet in the ice. It takes a lot of heat to melt that much ice, but that is their only explanation because they cannot hold to a fast production of ice. Yet this amount of ice produced would equate to about 1,000 years underneath the secular uniformitarian assumptions. So there is a lot more ice being deposited than what they would expect because we haven't been measuring this very long. So there's a lot more information that we can get into this, but in short, there is a lot of evidence suggesting that all this ice on Greenland, which is about 5,000 some feet deep, I believe, at the current time, is basically able to be put in there in just a few thousand years. So there's a lot more we could get into this, but since the main focus is climate change, because that's a bit more of a hot topic today, we will leave this for now. But I want to leave you with the fact that they really don't know what caused the Ice Age. U.S. News in 1997 said it was one of the 18 great mysteries of science. In 2001, although theories abound, no one really knows what causes the Ice Age. Perhaps the longest standing puzzle in Earth sciences is what caused the northern hemisphere ice sheets to come and go. In short, they don't have any explanation for it. They know it occurred because of the geological evidences. They try to make sense with it with their long time scales, but they can't get a good model to produce it. They don't know how it came about or how it left. Many of their mechanisms would lead to basically a snowball Earth. And they don't know how to come back from that. Mainly it got so cold that ice covered everything, which isn't shown in the geology, and then they somehow came back. So they don't have a really good method of showing this, of producing this. Their best guess is the astronomical or the revised Milankovitch theory. That is the most popular simply because they don't have any other explanation. That theory works by trying to use the tilt of the Earth, so we do have a tilt, about 23.4 degrees. That gives us our seasons. So when it's tilted towards the sun, we get summer. Tilted away from the sun, we get winter. Now, supposedly, there is a wobble to this. And they say that it is going to alternate quite a bit every 40,000 years. Now, that is assuming that no other forces act upon Earth. That is because they look at things as a pile of happenstance. A coincidence after a coincidence after a coincidence led to this Earth being able to support life. Therefore, it's just a bunch of spinning plates. One wrong move and it all topples down. One wrong moon, too. But basically, if one thing goes out of whack, all this goes away. A biblical perspective, a biblical worldview would expect to see design, and that is actually what we see. Whenever one thing changes, it changes something else that makes that first change less severe. But they have to hold to this because this is the only way that they can really even get close to an ice age. And the main evidence to support this theory, because it's just a theory, but the main evidence is to support it is deep sea ocean sediment cores. So they did the same thing as the ice cores, but in the middle of the ocean. They took some sediments and said, look here, this is an ice age. Look here, this is an ice age, and then dated them. This occurred about 1970s, and that was their main support for it. We'll get into this a little bit in a few more slides, but for now, let's just assume that, okay, yeah, that's good evidence. Let's just assume that. There are still a number of problems. One, the changes in the sunshine from that change in tilt wouldn't really produce enough cooling. You reduce the sunshine by a certain percentage, yeah, it's going to get cooler, but not by enough to produce an ice age. The heating at the high latitudes is also affected by ocean and atmospheric currents, meaning the warmth from the equator gets moved up to higher latitudes, basically making this very little. Remember, design is everywhere. Two, even if it didn't do that, you'd only get an ice age at the north or southern poles. You wouldn't get it on both poles at the same time. Remember, we're getting the ice age because it's leaning away from the sun. Therefore, you can't get what we see in geology. It still wouldn't produce what we expect to find, but this is their best guess. Now, they use this to suggest that we are going to have a future ice age. They were really worried about that a few decades ago. They still are a little bit concerned with this. Even as early or as recent as 2003, if the past is any indication, the Earth is at the end of another such warm period, poised to descend into a new ice age. And that is all because of these two deep-sea sediment cores. This was the main evidence. This was called the pacemaker of the ice age, or the ice age Rosetta Stone. This was their gold standard. And they built quite a bit of information on these two pieces of evidences. After a while, though, after a few decades, there was some changes made to the dating of this evidence. And as such, it basically toppled down this house of cards. Everything else that they've built on over 3 decades or so doesn't have anything to stand on because their key piece of evidence is no longer functional. Same way with Samson pushing down those 2 pillars, push down these 2 deep sediments, and the entire theory topples. But they don't like to recognize this. So they changed it from 700,000 years to 780. And at first, no one noticed. It took them a few years to realize, wait a minute, all this evidence that we've built on this, the foundation doesn't really support it anymore. But they still basically ignore it. They don't have an answer for it, so they don't bring it up. They don't want to look at it. It's the elephant in the room that they don't want to recognize. And that's because they don't have any other answer for it. And they continue to build. They continue to build on the evidences that they have, despite those evidences not having any foundation. And that has led to a reinforcement syndrome, which is a big problem in any scientific community. Confirmation bias, the seeking out of an answer and finding the answer you expect to find, doesn't always mean that you're accurate. We always look for what we expect to find, and we usually find what we're looking for, even if it's not there, scientifically and otherwise. They even wrote papers about how confirmation bias is so prevalent, and they found that it was. So it could be confirmation bias of the theory of confirmation bias, but it's hard. We're getting down a rabbit hole with that. But in short, you have to take that into account. So you can see here, this is what they had, this is what they now have. The lines and the peaks lined up, now they don't, and each time it gets further off the line. But all this, even if you don't take all this into consideration, you assume that all that is correct, it can still only work with a fragile climate homeostasis, meaning a sensitive climate, meaning that it is all just a bunch of happenstance, and one slight tilt to the left or the right is going to topple everything down. That is how they have it to get any kind of ice age change, because these effects will not produce the desired effects. It will not produce an ice age. And they have no method to produce an ice age. So they have to say, oh wait, little changes then are going to produce big changes, because everything is just mistakes. And you have seen this if you watch this movie, The Day After Tomorrow. You see ice just suddenly coming in, a big chill, freezing gas in a helicopter's tubes, and causing it to crash and all that kind of stuff. This is actually what they believe happened to the woolly mammoths. This is why they believe that they were in permafrost, because suddenly something changed and they had a massive freeze that froze them solid. I believe it had to drop to negative 150 based upon some tests on meat. I forget the company that did that, but basically they said they had to freeze that much to keep the meat from spoiling. Well, when you look at it a little bit more, the silt method, the silt model that we talked about previously in the Ice Age lectures is a much, much better explanation for this, especially since they have no idea how this occurs. But all this stems on who is in control. On, is this planet designed? Do we see a lot of redundancy in the systems, a lot of feedback cycles, a lot of big change doesn't really occur without, well, it doesn't really occur, period. We see a change here leading to another change that kind of counters the first change, making the first change not as big. But who is in control? Proverbs 19:21, many are the plans in a person's heart, but it is the Lord's purpose that prevails. God is in control, and he made this earth to be inhabited. We are not going to get into a snowball situation. We're not going to be put into an uninhabitable earth. For in him all things were created, things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or powers or rulers or authorities, all things have been created through him and for him. He is before all things, and in him all things hold together. God maintains us. He has control over all the factors that we see. Snow and clouds, stormy winds that do his bidding. And we have this promise that as long as the earth endures, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night will never cease. This was given right after the flood that caused the first ice age. And only ice age. And that ice age is not like what they expect. They expect a cold and nasty, a harsh environment. There were some areas that did have harsh environments, but for the most part, the earth was very lush, very great place to live because you had creatures being able to grow to massive sizes. It was not warm seas, a lot of plant life, animals spreading out. Go back to those lessons on the Ice Age, the time post-flood, to get more information on that. But God is our refuge and our strength. God blessed them and said to them, be fruitful, increase in number, fill the earth and subdue it. Rule over the fish in the sea, the birds in the sky, and over every living creature that moves on the ground. A lot of times you will see climate change, the solution being depopulation. And that is a problem because that goes against what we're told. We are told to subdue this earth, to go out and take control, to live in it, to fill it. In Job 36, how great is God beyond our understanding? The number of his years is past finding out. He draws up the drops of water, which distill as rain to the streams. The clouds pour down their moisture abundant. Showers fall on man. Who can understand how he spreads out his clouds, how he thunders from his pavilion? We can trust that God made this earth to be inhabited, that nothing we can do will be able to subdue him. We can subdue the earth, we are told to, but we are not going to be able to destroy this. Now, we need to be good stewards, but God has said that he will maintain this until he decides to destroy us. All this pursuit of Ice Age theory and the idea that the climate, that the earth is a fragile thing, that one small change can lead to disaster, has led to a lot of climate alarmism. And this is what we, in general, have, what we've experienced today. You've probably heard a number of claims throughout your life. If you're younger, probably not as many. If you're older, probably quite a few. That everything is going to be bad unless you do a lot of big changes. We are told change is bad and it's all your fault. All the scientists agree and that the science is settled. Now, in general, there are about 3 groups. We have scientists from the International Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, which is part of the UN. We have what would be labeled as skeptics or climate deniers, which also is a group of scientists. And we have politicians, environmentalists, and media. The last group is probably the loudest and has the most variety as far as motivations go. Of the first 2 groups, made mainly of scientists, there are a number of agreements between them. One, the climate is always changing. Both scientists, both groups agree, even those labeled climate deniers. 2, that carbon dioxide, CO2, is a greenhouse gas and is necessary for life. And adding more would lead to some warming. Atmospheric CO2, carbon dioxide, has increased since the mid-1800s. Both groups agree on that. And over the past 200 years, the Earth's temperatures have increased slightly and erratically about 1 degree Celsius total. But only since the 1960s have man's activities been sufficient to play a role. Now, what they mean by slightly and erratically means a little amount with no known pattern. Comes and goes, bit and bit, but in general it tends to go up about 1 degree Celsius over the last 200 years. But again, no real pattern. It's erratic. No confident prediction of the future global average temperatures or its impact can be made. And this is even according to the IPCC, the group associated with the UN. And no one in either group is claiming that the burning of fossil fuels leads to catastrophe. They are saying that yes, fossil fuels will lead to some change, but not catastrophe, not the groups that have the scientists in them. Now, you will probably find some scientists because it's hard to put people in groups. But in general, these 2 groups tend to agree on these points. Now, the question is it from carbon dioxide? Carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas, so we know that climate is changing. Both groups agree on that. The question is this the culprit? Now, greenhouse gases are very good at absorbing and emitting infrared radiation. Think of it as just heat. So sunlight is going to pass through the atmosphere and warm the Earth's surface. The Earth then gives off heat, and the greenhouse gas acts as a blanket. So it absorbs that heat coming from the Earth, and it emits it in every direction, including back down to Earth. So some get lost in space, but some goes back down to the Earth, warming the Earth. And it will warm the surface of the Earth and the lower atmosphere. So it's not just the surface, but also the atmosphere that gets warmed. So we need to remember that. And I'll go into the math behind this, but doubling the atmospheric CO2, Earth's average surface temperature would increase by 1 degree Fahrenheit with a doubling. That's a lot of carbon dioxide. And that's assuming everything else stays the same. But many scientists believe that there are many other factors that would likely compensate. Cloud coverage, it's very complex, but there's a lot of things that go into climate. Now, carbon dioxide isn't our only greenhouse gas. In fact, it isn't the main one. The main greenhouse gas is actually water vapor. Depending on the location, it can range from either 40 to about 90%. So this is a high 95%. This is the only chart I could find. I prefer to find a 91. But evidently somebody thinks it can even go up to 95. But just to show you that that's all water with a little bit of carbon dioxide and something else. You take just this little chunk here, and this is what you get. The reason why, generally, all you'll see is this chunk here, not the water vapor, is because we don't really affect the water vapor. Unless you want to go out and boil a lot of water, you're not going to produce the water vapor. And so they say that these are the main ones because this is the main ones that human has control over, that we have an effect on. I shouldn't say control over, but effect on. Yet most, if not the vast majority, is water vapor. Even then, while both agree that carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases have increased, we can only measure it since about 1960. Everything before 1959 is made from proxy indicators. So basically, we take some data that might indicate carbon dioxide and then assume based upon those. So it's not the most precise method of determining carbon dioxide. We can only determine carbon dioxide from the last 50 years. But most people tend to agree that in the last, 60 years now, not 2010, the last 60 years, since we've been able to measure it, it's increased more than prior. So only in the last 60 years. Even then, humans produce only about 4% of the total carbon dioxide produced each year. This chart here is from 2004 from the IPCC, the member of the UN, the committee that's part of the UN. So you can see here that vegetation and land in general produces about 439. Humans produce about 29, and ocean produces about 332. I believe these are tons, but I forget the units on this, but in short, the units don't matter. It's the percentages that we're looking at. Of that, humans only produce 4% of the carbon dioxide, which remember, the carbon dioxide isn't even the major greenhouse gas. So all that, humans can account for about 1% of the greenhouse gas effect. And even then, you can see that vegetation and the oceans take in more than they produce because plants will take in carbon dioxide. And whenever you have a equilibrium, a chemical change where you have gas being produced and gas being used, if you produce more on one side, it's going to cause the utilization of it to increase as well. So the more carbon dioxide in the air, the more that these plants are going to take in, and we'll get more into that later. But in short, right now, I want you to pay attention to the fact that we only produce about 4% of the total production of carbon dioxide per year, and it may have changed a little bit in the last 2 decades, but probably not by much. And humans account, in general, for about 1% of the greenhouse gas effect, less than 1%. And here's some of the proxy data. So this is the data that everyone tends to look at. This is the data since the 1960s, and you can see there seems to be an overlap, an increase in global temperatures, an increase in carbon dioxide concentrations. But if you go back to the proxy data, admittedly, there are some assumptions in this, but in general, you see the global temperatures decreasing, carbon dioxide staying the same. This goes back 1,000 years. Increase well before the Industrial Revolution, and then the Industrial Revolution occurs, and then even more after that. So you can see that if you look at just this chunk of data, this small section, there seems to be a connection. But if you look at the big picture, it's not the only thing affecting it, even if it is affecting it. Correlation does not equal causation. Because there's a number of things that will affect the climate. There are some short period effects, basically things that will change the temperatures over a few years, such as volcanic eruptions. We've seen this with Mount St. Helens, and even before then, in 1816, with the year without a summer. A massive eruption in the Pacific area occurred, and as such, we had frosts in the summer. Destroyed a lot of crops. It was a very hard year. We also have El Nino. That is changes in the circulation of water and air currents in the Pacific. Happens every 4 or 5 years. Very complex, but very interesting if you're interested in weather sciences. But that will change weather everywhere. But again, only for a year or two. Longer period effects, though, are more concerning long-term climate effects. The main one are sunspots. And technically, it is not the sunspots, but something called a faculae. The sunspots are actually cool, but the faculae occur with the sunspots, and they're the warm thing. But you can't really see them well, so the only thing you really have to know is that when the sunspots occur, things get warmer. But it is a little bit more complicated than that. But we can go back through history and see people recording the effects on the sun, seeing them look at the sun and say, oh yeah, the sun did this. And at that time, we see warmer temperatures. And this is why the long period sunspots are expected to be the reasoning behind the medieval warm period. So there was a warm period between 800 and 1200 AD. This is the time where the Vikings were going out and doing their Viking and colonizing all kinds of places. We know it was warmer then from a variety of things. One, because they were able to grow grapes in Iceland. We can't do that today. Despite all the changes in warmth that we experience today that they're telling us about, we still can't grow grapes in Iceland. They could then. There's a number of other things that we can look at in history that tell us how warm it was. All right. And so here you can see some of the changes through the last 2,000 years. We have the Roman warm period, a dark age cold period, the medieval warm period, and what is called the Little Ice Age. Another reason why we know that this occurred here is that in England, there used to be a fair on the River Thames every winter. So there's a river called Thames. During the winter, it would freeze so solid that the king and all the people would go out and have a massive fair on this river. Well before the Industrial Revolution had kicked in, before carbon dioxide has any effect, we can no longer do that, or they can no longer do it because the river would not freeze solid enough to have people safely on it. And that was occurring right there with the Little Ice Age. And there's many other factors that we can see recorded in history and then get information about how cold it would have to have been or how warm it would have to have been for these things to occur. This is from a book called Unsettled by Stephen Koonin. Past variations of surface temperatures and ocean heat content do not all disprove the 1 degree Celsius, 1.8 degrees Fahrenheit, rise in the global average surface temperatures anomaly since 1880 is due to humans. But they do show that there are powerful natural forces driving the climate as well, and they illuminate the scientific challenge of understanding these natural influences well enough to confidently identify the climate's response to human ones. In other words, the real question is not whether the globe has warmed recently, but whether to what extent this warming is being caused by humans. Both groups of scientists agree that the globe is warming. The question is what is causing it? There's a lot of data out there, but it does not seem to be, at least mainly, from our effects. So we talked about this, the Vikings going to Greenland, not Iceland, my mistake. We talked about the Little Ice Age, and all this likely due to sunspots. Now, there might have been some volcanism as well during the Little Ice Age, but sunspots seem to be the main factor. Again, another little chart that shows you here. But you might see things like this. Claims that the 1990s were the warmest decade of the last 1,000 years, with 1998 being the warmest year, period, in the last 1,000 years. So you see temperatures generally decrease, then, suddenly increase, and would you look at that, that's during the Industrial Revolution when carbon dioxide increased. But there's no medieval warm period. There's none of those past changes that we have just seen. This is because they weighted their data to show in the late 20th century the temperatures were rising. They basically put their finger on the scale and said, these data points, we're going to make them more dramatic so that we can get this effect. If you were to unweight it, you would get a much different image. So unfortunately, when anything becomes political, when there are more motivations than simply figuring out what is going on, you're going to get a lot of confirmation bias. You're going to get a lot of poor answers because they're not searching the truth. They're searching for something else.
I was curious, I read somewhere, and I might be wrong about this, that the rotation of the Earth is slowing down, or has slowed down some. Would that make a difference in the temperatures of the Earth?
Shouldn't.
The sun hitting the Earth?
Yeah, so there are claims that the Earth is slowing down, and it is to an extent. I want to say it's like a thousandth of a second per every 100 years, and that's mainly because of the moon. So it shouldn't affect the temperatures, even if it was dramatically increased, because the main reason why we have the changes in temperatures is the tilt, not the rotation. And they do say that the tilt changes, but that is assuming there's nothing else working on it, and it would still take 40-some thousand years for it to tilt, to change the tilt. So again, it's based upon their evolutionary theory, which, again, as we've shown, has a lot of problems with it. But no, the rotation, while it is slowing down because the moon is getting further away from us, it's still a very, very small amount. So you get an extra 1,000th of a second per day after every 100 years or something like that. A very, very small amount. Does that answer your question?
I think so.
Okay.
And I was curious too, of course, that may cause an effect of the moon pulling like that with our ocean currents and as well El Nino, how it affects it with the warming in the oceans and in the particular pattern that causes the jet stream to go through. I've noticed in the winters, sometimes when we have a milder winter, we have mostly more jet streams coming up from the southwest. where in the winter it's colder, sometimes a lot of jet stream will dip down into mid-United States.
Yeah, the moon is also getting further away and it will have an effect, yeah. But it's still a very small effect. I think the moon is only getting out about maybe 4 inches. I forget the time span, but it's moving very, very slow. So you might get a few extra feet in your lifetime at most, but not by much. And so there are many, many other things that will affect it that are closer. Cloud cover, the sunspots, and a number of other factors as well are bigger as far as their effect goes. Excuse me. But even their simulations are exaggerated. So this is where we're going to get that 100% increase in carbon dioxide equates to about 1 degree Fahrenheit number. So natural sun cycles, the sunspots, account for about 50% of the 20th century global warming. So the warming that occurred in the 1900s, half of that was likely due to sunspot activity. Now, carbon dioxide has increased about 30% since the Industrial Revolution. The other greenhouse gases have increased as well. We equate that to carbon dioxide, meaning that a total of about 60% of carbon dioxide equivalency units have increased since the Industrial Revolution. So we're all getting this to the base, the same units basically. So we assume that's increased by 1.2, some say higher, some say lower. This is above average as far as what people put out. But we have to divide that by half because half of that is from natural causes, which means we've increased 0.6 degrees Fahrenheit for a 60% increase of carbon dioxide equivalency units, which means that if you change that to 1, change that to 100, a doubling of carbon dioxide will equate to 1 degree Fahrenheit increase. In their models, so this is made with real-world data, in their models, though, they get 3 to 11 times that. Again, putting their finger on the scale. And even then, that is just using these surface temperatures. There are many things that take into account the surface temperatures. If you look at atmospheric data using satellites and weather balloons, it may even be lower than that, maybe as low as 0.8 degrees Fahrenheit. And then you further reduce that. Now, while satellites have only been measuring it since the 1970s, mainly 1980s, weather balloons have been used for much longer before then. And the atmosphere has less factors affecting it, so you're going to get more accurate data using these measuring systems. But all that we've talked about, I hope that at least you've taken away that some people say, yes, there is changing, some people say, no, there's not. In general, that the science is not settled. In general, that we have experts going both ways, and there are many factors affecting them as well as affecting the climate. So if you want to know more about it, please look into it. But I also hope that you take away that the scientists in general are not saying everything is going to burn down, because there is a lot of alarmism going on. Mostly, as we stated before, from politicians, environmentalists, and the media. If it bleeds, it leads. What is scary gets more shares. But in the last 50-some years, or more now, since it's not 2010, 2020, but there have been many claims. Civilization will end within 15 or 30 years unless immediate action is taken against problems facing mankind. This was in 1985. We are still here. The population will inevitably and completely outstrip whatever small increases in food supplies we make. The death rate will increase until at least 100 to 200 million people per year will be starving to death during the next 10 years. Made in 1970. We're still here, we're good. Life does something similar with air pollution. And we have this man here saying that by the year 2000, 30 years from now, the entire world, with the exception of Western Europe, North America, and Australia, will be in famine. The Associated Press. Officials say entire nations could be wiped off the face of the earth by rising sea levels if the global warming trend is not reversed by the year 2000. Even our Vice President Al Gore, after he was no longer in office, said that polar ice caps during some of the summer months could be completely ice-free within 5 to 7 years. Again, beyond that prediction, and so on. All their specific predictions that they have made, that I have found, if you found one that they have made and has been correct, please let me know. But everything that I've seen has been falsified. We've gotten past their predicted expiration date and are still fine. Even their generalized predictions are not the case. The Earth is greening and increasing in greenery, according to NASA. up to about 50% increase, with a less than 4% browning or loss of vegetation. Because a modest warming and increase in carbon dioxide is some of the best things that you can do for your plants. Put a greenhouse up, it's going to get a little bit warmer in there. Pump it full of carbon dioxide, you're going to get some of the biggest tomatoes that you've ever seen. It is great for crops. Hurricanes, while they have increased very slightly as far as intensity, only by 1%, no measurable increase in number. Animal extinctions predicted 30,000 per year, about 2. Even U.S. wildfires are down. You may hear about them more, but in general, in a 5-year period, they've decreased by 100,000. You'll even see reports being put out, reporting that almost 12,000 scientists say we need to do something about this climate emergency. Only about 2% were climate sciences. Only 2% were experts in climate-related fields. And even then, it is a small sampling. There are many that came out against it. For time's sake, I'll skip over some of these, but go back and read them. There's even been about 1,600 scientists, including 2 Nobel laureates, declaring the climate emergency a myth. Misguided climate change has metastasized to a massive shock journalist pseudoscience, according to Nobel Prize winner Dr. John F. Clausen. And more quotes. But what drives these people? What drives the alarmism movement? Paul Watson, co-founder of Greenpeace, it doesn't matter what is true. It only matters what people believe is true. Or Timothy Wright, president of the UN Foundation, we got to ride this global warming issue. Even if the theory of global warming is wrong, we'll be doing the right thing in terms of economic and environmental policy. And so on. Because the biggest problem with climate change isn't the climate change, it's the solutions. Carbon taxes, blasting particles into the air to reflect sunlight, a driving ban, and reduced electricity usages. Preventing people from getting what they need and preventing people from having the electricity to heat and cool their homes, it's going to lead to more deaths. It's going to lead to people in problems, not being able to get the medicine they need, not being able to get to where they need, not being able to heat their homes. Heat and cold deaths are a real big problem. Cold deaths more so than heat. More people die from cold every year than from heat. Again, another quote that I'm going to skip for time's sake. And that's because all these people deny a lot of things because they hold to an evolutionary connection. They hold to the evolutionary theory. They hold to that there is no God. They deny that Genesis is history. They hold to long ages, long ice ages, a fragile earth because of that, because we are just a pile of mistakes and happenstance. They seek population control and deny God's sovereign care. They think that we need to have less people because less people means less carbon dioxide. Less carbon dioxide means the earth survives because it's not people that's important, it's something else. They don't care about people. They try to say we're trying to save the earth for the future generations, by destroying the current generations. And it denies that God is in control. Our planet was designed by an all-knowing, loving creator. And we might expect our climate to change, but to be very stable when doing so. And even then, global warming isn't necessarily a bad thing. If we increase in temperature just by a little bit, by what we see, polar bear populations, which have been claimed to be one of the things we need to stop climate change for, have actually increased. Numerous forests, and even the Great Barrier Reef have increased in size. People are more likely to live because now we have electricity. We're not limiting that. We're less likely to die in heat than cold, which is also a good thing. More plants, more crops, more food. Because plants and crops grow very well with slight warming and carbon dioxide. And even then, say we get a little bit more melting of the sea ice, that opens up shipping, meaning people can get things cheaper, faster, and easier. Now, we can't say that's all going to be good. There might be some negative effects, but nor can we say that it is going to be a net harm either. So there is a big history as far as the changing of the climate, both political and actually historical, that you can see there. Warming, cooling, and warming. There are many things that affect the climate, humans being one of the smallest, if able to affect it at all. But in summary, there is only one ice age. The belief in multiple ice ages and long ages have led to the idea that the earth is a fragile thing, that the earth was not created, that the earth is not designed, despite what the evidence shows. And this has led to alarmism today. So we need to make sure that we do not feed into this alarmism. We need to be good stewards, but let us not feed into it. Let us not be scared by it. Let us not be alarmed. For resources, here are a few resources that you can dig a little bit deeper into. Excuse me. Next time, we'll be going over a different topic. I'm going to, again, hold it for mystery. But I will promise you that it's going to be out of this world. You'll laugh at that next time. But any other questions today as far as the climate change goes? Mm-hmm. Yeah, there has been, according to their theory, a number of ice ages, a number of extinction events. But what's very interesting is that it's only the last ice age, the only one that is supported geologically, the only one that the Bible points to that had an extinction event. All the others didn't. All the other 49 that they say happened didn't. So why are they concerned about this one? When 1 out of 50 produced a bad thing, the rest didn't. So why are they concerned about it then? There are a lot of motivations behind them. 1, their theories, 2, their politics, and so on. But yeah, that's a very good point. Any other questions, comments, or concerns?
Yeah, that's true, politics and other things. And from what I've read and studied and seen, I can attribute the hysteria, to 3 things. Pennies, power, and prestige.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why there's so much bias built in. And as far as the scientists concerned, some of those need money for grants
Mm-hmm.
to study it. So.
Yeah, scientists, unfortunately, they are not neutral. You always have to declare your biases at the beginning of each paper. They have to say, oh, I work for this company, I'm doing this, and so on. And whenever I get a new product out from a pharmaceutical company saying it does this, I look at it and say, oh, that's pretty neat, but I'll believe that when somebody else tells me. There is always bias, a lot of confirmation bias, and unfortunately, people don't always acknowledge their biases. But yeah, there's a lot of things affecting why it's being pushed so much. Any other comments or concerns, questions? All right.
With the deep sea core samples, I didn't quite connect all the dots. They're looking at those samples and seeing indication for ice ages because of the magnetic striation reversals. Is that correct?
So they're using the magnetic striation reversals to date them.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, and so they changed the date on those, which changed the date on their ice ages, basically.
Okay.
Yeah.
And what's the evidence that they see for ice ages in the,
So they are seeing stones being scraped against other stones, which they say, oh, that's a glacier coming over. But they don't see all the other like tills and stuff like that. The biblical explanation for those would be the flood moving rocks around and scraping each other, which we'd expect to see. But that wouldn't produce the tills and other things like that that we'd expect to see with an ice age. Does that answer your question?
it's interesting that we're seeing that in the floor of the ocean.
Mhm.
Are those tills and stuff in those core samples in the floor of the ocean?
Oh, no, there's not tills.
Okay,
They're seeing the rocks move around and it's scraping, seeing that rocks are moving.
okay.
But they're not seeing rocks piled up like a glacier would pile them up.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, in other words, at some point in the history of the floor of the ocean, things were moving.
Mm-hmm.
That's basically what we're saying.
Yep.
Okay.
And they used to think that there was another ice age that occurred, but they saw the rocks moving. I wish I had the data on this, but I didn't have that prepared. But they're like, wait a minute, all the fossils we're seeing are warm plants and warm animals, so it couldn't have been an ice age, so it must have been an underwater landslide then. And for a lot of the other ones, they don't have the fossils because it's deep sea sediment cores. You don't really get a lot from that.
I was thinking, I just wonder how accurate their instruments are. How do they show how accurate their instruments are? Last I knew, even carbon dating wasn't that accurate. They couldn't really trust it, so.
Yeah, carbon dating, you can trust it a little bit, but you always want to have something else to back it up. If you just have that alone, it may not be worth the paper that it's written on, the result. But yeah, there's a lot of things that we don't know. The best thing is to know what your test is going to tell you when it's not going to tell you. Yeah, and unfortunately, a lot of people just look at whatever their test says, even in the medical field, and say, oh, look, we got this factor here. That means this, despite seeing, oh, we got A, B, C, and D doing something else, which negates that. Or, you know, it doesn't matter how well your instruments are if you don't have the mind to process it, if you don't think about processing it. Any other questions or comments? All right, thank you.